Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward. On each episode of the High Strangeness Factor, while we explore all aspects of the paranormal and the unexplained, we put a special emphasis on the parallels and underlying patterns that seem to exist beneath the surface of all of these mysteries. And tonight we have a special guest who has a special book coming out very shortly. Brent Raynes has been immersed in the UFO controversy since January 1967, beginning at the age of 14. He is the editor of the monthly Alternate Perceptions online magazine, apmagazine.info, which he began as a small newsletter called Para-Ufology Forum back in 1985. He is the author of Visitors from Hidden Realms, 2004, and On the Edge of Reality, 2009, and soon will have a third book published, John Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. Raynes has lectured from coast to coast and has appeared on Coast to Coast AM radio, Art Bell's Midnight in the Desert, several times as a guest of the late Brad Steiger on The Jeff Wren Show, Gene Steinberg's The Paracast, Tim Beckley and Tim Swartz Exploring the Bizarre, and many other radio programs, including Spaced Out Radio, as well as hosting his own audio programs for Alternate Perceptions. On November 12th through 14th, 2010, the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment, invited Raynes to speak at a special UFO conference that they had organized at Virginia Beach, Virginia, and even named the conference after his first book, Visitors from Hidden Realms. On December 3rd, 2005, Brent spoke at an earlier ARE-sponsored UFO conference. See his video lecture on YouTube. His talk was entitled Visitors from Hidden Realms, Perspectives from Star Elders, Shaman, and UFO Visitors, which concluded with a powerful meditation using the Peruvian whistling vessels. His main interest has been reports of close encounters and contact experiences, and investigating the parapsychological and psycho-spiritual components of those situations. Brent Raynes has a chapter entitled An Overview of the History of Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, Contact Paradigms, that was published in the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences massive volume, Beyond UFOs, The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence in 2018. Brent Raynes may be contacted at Brent Raynes, that's one word, Raynes spelled R-A-Y-N-E-S, at yahoo.com. And also Brent Raynes, ARE Conference, youtube.com. Brent, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
Thank you, Steve, for that great introduction. I'm honored to be here on your show. I know you've been this is a fairly new show here, and congratulations. I think you've been doing this about 2 months now.
I guess so. About that, it's been kind of nice. I've been doing a little a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files as well, and it was through that show that led to this one. So it's just kind of a nice serendipitous event, and it's a lot of fun talking to people like yourself about stuff that I love to talk about.
Yeah, that's what I like about doing the interviews I do for Alternate Perceptions is there's so many people that you can interview who have things of interest that that's interest to you that they're exploring, and I love, of course, the whole multidisciplinary aspects. The UFO contact, the MIB, the the consciousness factors, quantum physics, parapsychology. I mean, you've got to have really a multidisciplinary approach, I think, to really cover the really meaningful big picture of this field, and that's what, of course, John Keel was all about. You know, in the beginning, he was like you and me. He thought it's extraterrestrial nuts and bolts, case closed, and then he actually began to look into it from the perspective of a field investigator, and found out it was a little more complex than he originally thought.
Well, I think you and I have both been, I don't know if we want to say influenced or infected by John Keel for a very long time. It's gotten to the point where, I was on another radio show recently, Task Force Griffin with Commander Cobra, great show, and he
Hmm.
asked me, he said, at this point, he knows the way that people like you and I look at the way things inevitably connect together. And he said, Is it at this stage now where everything you read or view, you look at it from that perspective?" And the answer is yes. It's inescapable. It's very hard to just look at cryptids or strange lights in the sky separately. But what was it? Now you got the bug at the age of 14, and specifically your introduction says January in 1967. Was there a particular event or something that just grabbed your interest back then?
Well, Steve, when I look back on it, now actually I was interested back in March of 1966, but I didn't actually start collecting material, doing the stuff that a ufologist would do until I remember there was something in the papers. I think it was either Associated Press or UPI. There was some story from some country where these metal spheres were coming down and found on the ground, and they were trying to identify what they were, where they came from. I remember clipping that out of the local uh, newspaper, and I began to. At that time, I had just read, I think, a month or two before. Uh, Frank Idra's Flying Saucer Serious Business, which presented the
Oh yeah.
extraterrestrial nuts and bolts perspective, and so that's where I was at the time. And I remember one of my first correspondents was Lucius Farish out in Plummerville, Arkansas, and he was well known for his research into the airship phenomena of the 1896, 97, and 1909 and 1910, and that we had here in America. And he collected all kinds of newspaper clippings, and I come out with my little mimeograph newsletter, and I would exchange what clippings I had, my little newsletters, for his, news clippings, and I mean that's how I got started. And I actually I when I started my newsletter, mimeograph newsletter, the Scientific Sauce Writers Review, as a teenager, I had Lou Farish as one of my consultants. I might have been airships. I remember having Lauren Coleman as an ABSM consultant. Uh,
That's
he was
great.
living he was living out in Illinois at the time, and a few other people that had particular interests, but anyway, that's how I got started. But when I started reading John Keel and Jacques Vallée and Brad Steiger, it kind of shook up the my perspective on the nuts and bolts ET thing a little, and I began to look into paranormal things. I even went around. I'm from Maine originally, and I was going around investigating haunted houses for a while. And the more I dug into them, I mean, it was like an endless number of them. I'd go to one, and they'd tell me, "Oh, there's a house down the street too. You might want to check out." And one case would lead to another.
Well, there's some. I was stationed in the Navy up near there, and I actually was in a store once, and somebody was talking about a haunted house where the rocking chair was going by itself. Now, there's a lot of old homes up there that go back a lot of years, so I imagine there's quite a history. But you were a few steps ahead of me, where you actually had consultants. We had a small group, and there were four of us. We published a magazine called the UFO Phenomenon, and but it was more my friends Kevin and Rick were the guys behind that. So, but March '66 you mentioned that was the swamp gas era that must have caught your interest with when Dr. J. Allen Hynek uttered the famous words that some of these sightings may have been explained by swamp gas.
Well, at the time there was sightings all over the United States. Of course, Michigan got the most attention in the papers, but I remember in the state of Maine we had in March of '66 we had the probably the most spectacular was up in Bangor. Some call it Bangor, but Bangor, and there was a gentleman by the name of John King who said that he had seen a craft just a foot or so above the ground, disc-shaped craft with a kind of a dome on top, the classic, and he had a pistol and he fired at it and he heard I think he took 4 shots and he was sure he heard 2 pings, and so he felt that he struck a metallic surface, um, and it took off, and anyway, and then in April there was an incident in Bingham, Maine, with a young girl who came running into her house telling her mom and dad that she had seen this big round ball and had a little window in it and a man looking at her, and people kind of took that serious. And I think there was some kind of a impression on the ground too in the area that people had found, but there were a lot of people who were reporting strange lights and things in Maine at that time too. I'm sure if you went around the country looking at newspaper files, you'd find just every state had some kind of sightings at that time going on.
Right. It was there was a lot going on, and also there were a lot of very credible people, police officers and so forth, that were reporting these things. And even back then, while the press was a little bit tongue-in-cheek occasionally, they actually would report this fairly objectively sometimes. Um, now,
Hmm.
my first, well, I had read been reading John Keel for a while, and his an article would show up now and then, uh, and I followed him along with a lot of other people. The book where I really sort of where you talked about your comfort in the ETH realm, sort of we both had very comfortable paradigms. We were very happy
Hmm.
with that setup. And then I read first I read I think it was called Strange Creatures from Time and Space back then, which has been retitled. The book. Let's see. I can't remember the title right now, but it's been retitled. But that's where he first introduced the idea of windows, which he was trying to come to grips with the idea that these things, UFOs, cryptids, or whatever, seem to pop in and pop out. People will see these things, credible people will report them. They might even leave footprints or burn marks or whatever, but then they're kind of gone after a while. But the book that just and I came kicking and screaming at first, was UFO's Operation Trojan Horse. So how did you discover John Keel? And you did something I never did. You began to correspond with John Keel.
Well, what happened is he was writing a lot of articles for Sager and a lot of men's magazines, and I was a teenager. I had to kind of hide them from my parents because
Yes.
they had a lot of pictures of them that they would not have
And
approved
and I,
of.
and I should say they were not very bad by today's standards. They were, I guess, they had a few scantily clad females in there, but nothing anywhere to the level of what you can find today. Just thought I'd point that out. Now
Right.
of course, I don't know that personally. Somebody told me about that, but go ahead, Brent.
Absolutely, yes. Well, of course, that's where I first, when these magazine articles, began reading about Keel's ideas, and and I started corresponding with him in October of '69. And I had my newsletter, so I was sending Keel copies of my newsletter too. And he would, when his anomaly came out, he would send me this newsletter he had called Anomaly, which was kind of like for insiders in the UFO field, people who were interested in what his research was. And sometimes he'd have clippings, other times he'd have different articles that he wrote or someone else wrote that he thought was noteworthy. And so October '69, his books hadn't come out on the subject yet, but they were on their way. And as I remember, Strange Creatures from Time and Space was actually supposed to be part of Operation Trojan Horse, but
Yes.
they whoever he sent it to did not want the book to be that big, so he just sort of split it in half. And the I think the book you're talking about that was Strange Creatures of Time and Space, redone later under a different title, was Complete Guide to Mysterious
Yes,
Beings.
that's it, and it's in trade paper size too. So if people want to look for it.
And by the way, I recently interviewed for the book Sandra Martin, who was his probably his last literary agent, and she actually got the book published for him, and he said it was the best cover that he had had on one of his books. He was very proud of it, and they, I think, paid him pretty well too for it. And
Was that the more recent version or the original version? The cover.
the more recent, yeah,
Okay.
the complete guide, yeah. And anyway, I corresponded with Keel, for I guess about 2 years, pretty regular there until I went into the Navy in '72. Uh, and then a few years later, I got out and I wrote back to him when I was in Tennessee, and he says, "What the hell are you doing in Tennessee?" He said, "I thought you were still in the Navy or the Marines. What was it?" Yeah. So at least he remembered me. Uh, but he was quite an interesting character, and I got later on. I talked with him on the telephone. Um, I wanted to interview him, but he was always cagey about it. He'd say, "They're such a drag. Let's just talk." So, and I ended up one time talking with him for about an hour, and I covered everything I wanted to interview with him about. And then years later, I thought, if I had recorded that, I could produce that now. But he'd always say, just go ahead and use one of my other interviews out of some other magazine. And I thought, nah, I don't want to do that. But he'd joke about he was Valley's ghostwriter.
Yes, and that's
Uh,
of course we're talking about Jacques Vallée, who his first couple of books were very nuts and bolts, Challenge to Science and Anatomy of a Phenomena, and but then he wrote Passport to Magonia, where he made the connections between elements of folklore and some modern day UFO experiences, and then he became, I guess you could say, very Keel-esque in some of his viewpoints.
yeah, yeah, and he actually his book was published in the year before Keel's Trojan Horse and Strange Creatures, and but the both of them, their ideas quite similar, and um, in the beginning, Keel felt that Valley and Hynek were really resistant to his ideas, and Hynek he said had kind of complained about Keel, and I was, when I went into the Navy, I was out there at Great Lakes Naval Training Academy, and I would when I was off from that on Liberty, I would go down to this was in '72, and I called him up and wanted to meet with Dr. Hynek, and he kind of put me off at first, and finally he said, "Well, my book, The UFO Experience, had just come out. If you read it, get it, read it, kind of digest the contents, maybe we can get together and talk sometime." So I got the book, and when I went to talk with him, I brought the book with me, got me an autograph, which I still have the book here on the shelf.
Oh, that's cool.
And we got to talking, and at the time I was kind of iffy about Keel, and he kind of surprised me. He says, "Well, I find his writings very, very interesting," and I thought, "Oh, well," you know. and, and he also talked with me about the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington State. He was quite interested in these ongoing sightings of UFOs, and of course they also had Bigfoot, and the Native Americans were involved in all of that, and so and then I had heard when he was involved in the Hudson Valley UFO wave in the 1980s that he had commented about, I wonder if there's any ancient sites where these things are appearing around, because Keel talked about windows and stuff, and
Yeah.
and I was told that they had, and that he responded that well, I guess maybe Keel was onto something there.
Was he talking about the stone chambers? Do you know?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the stone chambers, and they were supposed to have been, like shadow figures and orbs and things around those.
Right.
Uh,
I spent the night out there around one of those. It was inspired by Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who had spent the night out there near Hawk Rock, which is near a chamber they call the Solstice Chamber. And I thought if I'm going to see, now I'm the guy that doesn't experience anything, but I thought if I'm going to see something, I'm going to, go there. So I spent the night there, a little bit nervous for a while, alone. And of course, I experienced nothing. But I had heard, but I know Rosemary experienced some things in that area. She had seen little shadowy forms and some kind of a strange craft-like thing passed overhead. So I know that people have, yes, have experienced things out there.
Yeah, and of course, the forward that Rosemary wrote for my book, she talked about how she felt Keel and others are kind of wired a certain way, and some people are just more susceptible. There
Yeah.
was um, Hynek originally worked by the philosophy, and a lot of ufology adopted it for years, and I understand why they did it. A lot of people who are repeaters when it comes to UFO sightings, they may have a sighting in the beginning that's quite compelling. I mean, Betty Hill became a repeater.
Yep.
I'm sure that her and Barney had, from all we know, their initial sighting there, and the White Mountains in New Hampshire in 1961 was a very enigmatic phenomena. But later on, and I've been out in the field with her. I mean, she pointed up to I mean, I was with her, and we stopped at this tower, and there was a beacon on the top of the tower. And I got out of the vehicle. She stayed in the vehicle, I think, and I just took a look, and she was telling me that it was something new. She hadn't seen it, I don't think, before this. And and then we left. And what we did, I was with her for in the Kingston, New Hampshire area, and we rode around down to Massachusetts and places and did some interviews with different people. But we also sky watched at night sometimes in this landing area, she called it. And anyway, I wrote down on notes, and she did the same, what all that we saw and experienced. And then when we got together, and we swapped. Here's my notes, and she gave me hers. And I noticed that she wrote that I had stepped out of the vehicle to watch a fireball, and I thought that was just a light on the tower.
A little artistic embellishment.
Yes. So anyway, I know that these things happen, and but there are these experiences, the contact experiences that have this full spectrum of the bedroom invaders, the aliens coming in through the walls, or different things, and the paranormal elements, the physical elements. It's all very, very terrifying for some of them. Sometimes it's almost like a religious experience. There's a kind of a, you know,
And the lines between what we think of as separate subjects begin to blur the more we get into it. UFOs, poltergeist phenomena, cryptids, and so forth.
yeah, yeah. It seems like it's difficult. A lot of people questioning what is observed, trying to figure it out, and as opposed to the question of how it's observed. And John Keel expressed decades ago that ufology should be kind of like a branch of parapsychology, and I think we see more and more work in the multidisciplinary area by some. We still have the factions that don't want to touch it. We have people in parapsychology that don't want to touch UFO material. Fortunately, years ago, we did have people like D. Scott Rogo, who was a parapsychologist
Oh yeah,
who
he was
became,
superb. Yeah.
and Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who became a good friend of mine, who was a psychiatrist and studied parapsychology. And in 1968, he wrote an article for Medical Journal on some cases that he was involved with interviewing UFO witnesses. And it was just something he thought would be interesting to do. And it was, after he got it published, it was going to be his swan song. And John Keel found out about this and contacted him and encouraged him to stay in the field. And so he did, and he went around interviewing, investigating people on this. Found that there was always, again and again, the psychic elements to these cases, with very credible people, and he even, I think, 1983, 84, he wrote a two-volume book called UFO Dynamics, over 500 pages. Keel said it was one of the most important books out there. And yet he said, the UFO buffery has just completely ignored it like they do most important things.
Yes. Yeah, it's excellent. It's since you can sometimes find it in the single volume, but it also became one volume, and somebody republished it not too long ago. I don't know if it's still available or not, but it is a superb book. Uh, Another thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned Rosemary. She wrote a superb introduction to your book. Uh, by the way, the name of your book is John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. And she called Keel a man ahead of his time.
Hmm.
And I know this because you were kind enough. I spoke about John Keel at last year's Mothman Festival, and you made available to me the PDF of the some of the material you had written up to that point, which really helped with my presentation. And I learned all kinds of stuff about John Keel that I did not know about. So I appreciate that very much.
Well, no, no problem. I've been learning a lot of things I didn't know about Keel in the process, and Rosemary, had helped me too to find, besides herself, who had actually known Keel face to face,
Yes,
and other people. And she put me in touch with Patrick Hugh, who actually republished Keel's Jadoo with some chapters that had never seen the light of day previously. And then, which I thought was really good. And
yes,
uh, he put me in touch with Sandra Martin, who was actually a literary agent in New York City who loved to write self help books. And she was a great interview too. She was, Keel was a magician, and that's what kind of spurred him on back in, when he went over to overseas to want to see what the street magicians over there in Egypt and India and places, the kind of, they're supposed to, some of them pretending to be holy men, but they had, magic tricks they were actually performing. And he wanted to find out how they did it, and expose them. And, and in the process, though, he came away puzzled by some of the things that he experienced. There was a holy man that he was looking for over there who ended up finding him. And actually,
didn't the holy man see him at a distance? Have a vision of him coming to see him or something like that? I think.
well, I'm really not sure. I
Okay.
just know that Keel was, walking one day, and suddenly this guy uh, says his name, and he turns around and he introduces himself, and he's this elusive guy that he'd been looking for quite some time. And instead of him finding the guy finds him, and in the process, Keel wants to know how you do the mind reading thing, and he says, well, it would take a long time to really go into it, but let's try something. And you know, he tells Keel, "Oh, try something hotter than a pair of boots." And so then he does it again, and he hits it on the nail on the head once again, a second time. And so Keel came away convinced that people can do this telepathic thing. And he also was in a temple one time where this guy was supposed to be able to call spirits, and this three-legged stool came out of a corner of this temple and started circling around him, and he's there with his hands looking for strings, and he never found any. He was always kind of puzzled by that. And of course, then in Tibet, he was, hearing stories about the Yeti, and he saw some footprints and heard the sound. He thought he might have seen it across the lake, but it could have been a bear. We've already talked about that one.
Yes. Well, there's a good interview in one of the collections. I think it's called "The Great Phonograph in the Sky," which was one of Keel's catchphrases. But there are several anthologies out of his articles and so forth. There's an interview in there. I forget the source, but he talks specifically about tracking the Yeti and hearing these strange calls. And he was forthright about it that he what he saw, he wasn't quite sure if it was a Yeti or not, but the publisher wanted to stress that it was a Yeti. because to sell more books, I guess. But and it could have been. We don't really know. But yeah, Jadoo it's a fascinating book, and of course he had a very colorful military career before that. I know that when he was a young child, he saw his first UFO, I think. But didn't he see another fairly spectacular UFO when he was in Egypt? I think that is mentioned in
Yeah,
Jadoo.
yeah. He did have a sighting um, in Egypt, and I think it was 1954, and it was one of the classic saucer type things. When he was only 7, he recalled he was telling in an interview with Tim Beckley about seeing a spherical glowing object with his mother and his stepfather as they were driving around in a place called Concert Ega, I think it was called, somewhere in upstate New York. And what was interesting, he said, is this experience was so profound to him, and it was burned into his brain cells. He said, but when he later wanted to question both of them about it, they didn't know what he was talking about. So that was his first experience with memory being
Yes, and the way some people will be in a group, and maybe only some of them will see the UFO or the phenomenon, and the others won't. Again, like you say, won't know what you're talking about.
yeah. Carl Jung, when he wrote his book, the late great Swiss psychologist who wrote his last book on the subject of UFOs in uh, 59, I think. Anyway, he was telling in this book that what he calls psychoid, that's not quite, it's kind of like this maybe part mind, part matter, part psychic involvement there, but that he thought it might relate to the UFOs because he was with a group of people, 5 people all total, and they would the other people would saw this like this moon shaped object over the medium's abdomen, and they couldn't understand why Young couldn't see it because he was standing right there, and these other 4 people could clearly see this. And I had a MUFON state director here in Tennessee recently telling me that she was aware of the high strangeness factor like this because she had investigated a case a few years ago where there were 4 people who were just amazed when this craft came down over a body of water, and they were trying to point it out to these other people, and these other people could not see it. And so
Well, it's yeah. For some reason, it's if this was clearly an objective nuts and bolts phenomena, uh, we wouldn't be dealing with this kind of disparity with people seeing these things.
right, and I always like to point out in Strange Creatures from Time and Space, Keel had pointed out back then that are ghosts really UFOs and UFO entities, or are UFOs really ghosts? And he ended it with saying, take your choice or take your pick. People have seen these things, what looks like a solid craft, just go through trees, go into a hillside. Sometimes at close range, a woman that was an American. She was a master's in experimental psychology and anthropology, and she lived in a village that was north of Rio de Janeiro, an isolated village up in the hills there. And she was driving along this creek, came around a corner on this hillside. This big cylindrical, metallic-looking craft with what looked like windows was sliding into a solid hillside, and her mind just couldn't wrap itself around
Right.
how can this be, and she shared that with me and told me she knew of other cases in Brazil of similar incidents. She'd even seen a 4-legged creature in her home that was actually very real to her, but at the same time, it wasn't fully solid. It was kind of transparent. She could see through part of it. It walked up the steps by her. It had a mean set of teeth, and they got to the top steps and just disappeared. And she said, just by chance, she had met about 3 or 4 other people who had seen the very same thing. And she had even known there was kind of a chupacabra outbreak in a village that she had spoken with a family that had seen a UFO, and they were telling that at certain times, this man and his, I believe his daughter, said that they had seen this like black dog with glowing red eyes.
Wow.
I mean, this is the stuff that is very Keelian.
Yes, and very much like the black shuck of British folklore as well.
Hmm.
It just all seems to connect. And I know that Keel, but while Keel's thinking wasn't static, there was a time period where he thought that perhaps the only objectively real aspect of the UFO phenomena were those strange, those damnable meandering lights, he used to call them, and that the people, they might be saying a UFO, a giant UFO, or a cryptid, but he thought that the what he would call the facade wasn't that important, that there was a cosmic mechanism behind the phenomenon.
Hmm.
And
And
oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, I mean, there's so many things like that. He studied the Marian apparitions, and he felt that, like Fatima and all these other ones that have gone into the Catholic history books, and he pointed out all these similarities to the UFO contact encounters, or close encounters where beings were seen, a lot of the same symptoms and effects, and that's in. He went into quite a few instances of that in Operation Trojan Horse, and it's it yeah, it's and I know that when I actually after Keel passed away, I was involved with a group of paranormal researchers, two of whom were actually uh, contact experiencers, and I was shown, how to operate the ghost box, and I was really skeptical. I mean, I didn't, my wife and daughter attended a session that I was there, but I chose to go to another room and just look after my grandson, and they were telling me these weird interactive things that happened. So I thought, well, I'll go back and follow up on this, but I noticed that there were some things that seemed to be coming out, and out of this box on different investigations, went to haunted sites and so on. And then we're all together one day and up in Thompson Station, south of Nashville. And that friend of mine, these two contactees are there, or abductees, as they call themselves. And I said, if you don't mind, we're going to do this session in your home here. It was Sandy Nichols' home. And I says, let's try to reach out to John Keel if you don't mind, because it was exactly a year ago today he passed away, and that night what happened convinced me that we were dealing. Yeah, I mean the only explanation I could think of is somebody out there with a radio transmitter, and I mean we were there. Um, Talking and doing two sessions. One about I think about like 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the evening. Another one around midnight. I had a hard time imagining someone out in the bush somewhere, just waiting for us to catch an opportunity to say something about John Keel. But I mean, we got it on I think three recorders. Um, and I've reposted some of these audios in my reality check and alternate perceptions in the February and March issue of 2017.
Okay.
And but we got John Keel. Brett asked him, you know, can you ask his spirit guide to say, can you get John Keel to say his name? Within 8 seconds, a male voice said John Keel. And the thing is, you know, I've never heard John Keel, I don't think, on just a regular AM radio program, but I've heard it a number of times. One time here at the house, uh, got John Keel, Brent, and then Bert here. And Bert was a friend of mine who had passed also, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, the psychiatrist.
Oh, right.
So, I mean, these things were so interactive. And usually it was just very brief things. But one time, uh, at the end of a session, we'd say, please, clear. In other words, it was our code for, end the session. And we'd hear, when a voice would say clear, we'd shut off the recorder or the radio. I mean, the radio, yeah.
Right.
And one time, clearly, I mean, you could hear it on the audio. This cannot clear. This is energy. And I told Brett Oldham this, who's an abductee, and he was the one that introduced myself and Sandy and others to this, the technique he used for Ghost Box. And he says, well, maybe we need to explain to some of them what we mean by clear. And then we had like Enoch or Enoch or Enoch, or I mean, it was Enoch. Well, let's see, or Enoch, and we weren't
Right.
sure which we were hearing, but we heard it a number of times. So one day I'm here at home, and I'm saying, I said Enoch or Enoch? Is it with an O or an I? And I did this for about maybe 3 minutes, and nothing was coming through. And all of a sudden, here at my house, a male voice said, Enoch with an O. And I said, holy blank.
Yeah.
And I repeated what it said, and then you can play the recording and you hear it. And one of the things that was kind of evidential to me was, and I think it kind of scared the researcher. He's interested in psychic phenomena, nuts and bolts UFOs, but he wants to keep them separate. And I had done a interview with him. My daughter and myself interviewed him over the phone, and anyway, it was very staticky, and a couple people even commented how it was almost like the Ghost Box background. And my daughter wanted me afterwards. She thought it was kind of strange, and to set up the Ghost Box, see if someone had a message for Richard Hoffman, who I had known years earlier up in Ohio when I was up there back in the 70s. And I suddenly discovered around this time that he was also a MUFON investigator now living in near Huntsville, Alabama. So I went ahead and, my daughter wanted to do this. So I got the radio, and I got the recorder out and the wires and hooked it all up to some speakers, stereo speakers. And we started out, and it was all staticky and one thing and another. And I said, okay, if you would say his name, I'll send him a copy. And so this voice says, Rich Hoffman. And so I send it to Rich. Well, this is interesting here. I sent it to him, and he says, wow, what do you call that? I can hear you talking. It's interactive. He said, I was involved with a group one time where we had just a recorder. We'd play it back later, but you seem to be talking to this intelligence, saying Rich Hoffman. I said, yeah. And I said, he said Rich instead of Richard, so it must have cut off the back part of your name. He said, no, Brent, my friends call me Rich instead of Richard. Rich Hoffman is correct. So, I mean, that kind of blew me away, because I thought that, it was a little glitch in the transmission, and come and find out, no, that's how people refer to him. The guy that introduced me, Charles Wilhelm, up in near Cincinnati, Ohio, back in '75, would always call him Richard Hoffman. But yeah, Rich was right.
Strange stuff. I want to remind everybody that you are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, and tonight we're talking to Brent Raynes, the author of the forthcoming book. And is that due about August, Brent?
I sure hope so.
Okay, I hope so too. But
I'm working through some technical stuff here. I'm
okay,
doing this book. Self-publishing is not something I've ever done, so it's a little tricky. But I wanted to add about this. What was interesting is, and I remember talking to Sandy and Brett. That Keel had said, you can use this to talk to ghosts, or you might even talk to the aliens. And so, a couple of times when I wasn't there with them, they actually tried it and said this voice that sounded more monotone, alien-like, started communicating with them, and they noticed the normal ghost-type voices sort of got quiet. And one night, one of them, his wife was outside, and she saw like a spherical globe type thing over Sandy's house, and pointed it out to Brett. and he only caught the tail end where it was kind of like she said it was like it was kind of collapsing into itself. It was a severe, and then it just sort of boom.
Hmm.
Uh, and so it's pretty unusual. But it's Keel always said that um, I know that he wrote about a friend who was getting EVPs, and the friend thought it was a real person, and John said, no, it's just these extraterrestrials, the elementals. They can mimic any voice and come up with all these details. And so you're left with, that possible scenario.
And,
Was it really
or with
Keel?
that great phonograph in the sky that he was always talking about.
Yeah, maybe it's part of the Akashic records that someone's able to tap into and send information back, because some of the things we got was very Keelian. Like I wanted to play this game, and this Keelian personality didn't seem to appreciate it, because I said, I'm going to mention some names and you tell me what you think of them. And when I played it back, this voice that to me sounded like John Keel said, and what I think of you.
Well, Brent, Frank Sumption, who created the original Frank's box, and
Mm-hmm.
even Richard Shaver of the infamous Shaver mystery, he had a dream one night of a creating some kind of a box. Both of them, their original intent was to contact otherly world beings. Even Frank Sumption, I think his original idea was to contact ET. So, and again, the lines blur. When the voices come through, we simply can't be sure what's going on. There's so much. Keel's childhood is fascinating. His military service is fascinating. I wonder if you talk a little bit about the writing of the Mothman prophecies. I know that a good part of it was left on the cutting room floor by, as Keel said, faceless editors, and he salvaged. Keel was, another aside here. Colin Wilson, the great British researcher who's no longer with us, also, in his book Alien Dawn, that he had corresponded with Keel. He wrote that John Keel is incapable of writing a dull sentence. And boy, if you read the Mothman prophecies, that nothing is truer. And I know that he salvaged some of that into the Eighth Tower. But if I recall reading in your book, there was I think you had a discussion with him about the how big the Mothman prophecies could have been if he had included everything that had happened in the Ohio Valley in that year.
Yeah, he said that he could have produced 6 volumes if there had been enough interest at that time. But he says most publishers did not want to go into 6 volumes on this kind of a subject, And at the time, he really wasn't too excited about writing the Mothman prophecies. It was something that he kind of moved on to. He was really best known, I guess, for writing uh, comical things, make jokes and things. He was quite a jokester, and he had a lot of other interests. And he had an honorary PhD in herpetology and archaeology. And he had snakes in his apartment in New York City, which freaks some people out.
It freaks me out, and it happened in the past and several states away. So that's is
Yeah.
pretty freaky.
But yeah, he had a lot of interest, not just the UFO thing, and what I always find interesting, he started out, he was uh, a big reader. I mean, he was always reading stuff on magic, and he got into 14 at a young age, and uh, uh, a lot of materials, science and physics and things. And he was interested in aviation. And years later, as an adult, he did get a pilot's license. And but at age 14, he was writing a column in a local paper, the Perry Herald, called "Scraping the Keel." He made $2 a week doing that. I think that might have been good money. And at age 17, with 75 cents in his pocket, he hitchhiked to New York City to make his mark on the world. He had an honorary PhD in herpetology and archaeology. I already said that. But in 1951, he got drafted into the military, into the army, and they found out he was a writer, and so he got assigned Frankfurt as the American Forces Network, and he did a remote broadcast from the great Pyramid of Egypt and Frankenstein's castle. And later, when he got out of the army, he was a foreign correspondent in Paris and Berlin and Rome and Egypt. And this is pretty good for a guy who, you know, didn't graduate high school when he got
A-
into all
And
this.
he left home with, I think, a cardboard box full of his belongings when in his teens. And then he end up in Greenwich Village, I think, and trying to write.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes. And his first paranormal investigation had to do with the old farmhouse that he lived in, hearing rappings on the wall.
yeah. He tried to work out some kind of a code where they could interact with one another, and you'd ask him questions like,
Uh,
when's the war going to end or something, or
But it's interesting that I mean, obviously it was a poltergeist situation, but rather
mhm.
than being somebody like me that would probably have run screaming into the next county, he faced up to it and he tried to communicate with it. And I think that sent him off to the library to study any book he could find there on, the occult. I don't think they called it the paranormal in those days, but occult books or what have you. But and I think you also wrote that he would clean out all the books in the local library and read everything in there.
Yeah, and he was also, when he was 18, had a room just off Times Square, and he had this experience where his bedroom, one night started glowing, and this indescribable light, kind of a pinkish light, and suddenly he knew all these things. It was like he got a download, but the next day he couldn't remember what it was all about, but he knew that somewhere in his subconscious this information may have still lingered, and so it seems like these early experiences he had, unlike a lot of the mainstream ufologists, he was prepared early on for kind of, he had that background that he came along over the years and could look at things a little differently than the average Joe, so to speak.
Well, I think DougSkinner.com has collected a lot of uh, Keel memorabilia, photographs, old letters, and so forth. And I know there are some other books out there that sort of expand on the Mothman prophecies, get into uh, some of the writings, some of the musings that became the Mothman prophecies. There's also a lot of other anthologies out there, so there is a good deal of material out there on Keel, which is great. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so happy about your book coming out, uh, which is John A. Keel, the man, the myths, and the ongoing mysteries, is because there was a period of time, not so many years ago, that even when he was still alive, I remember he was on Art Bell in 2003 when the Mothman Prophecies movie was debuting. And Art Bell, as much as he knew about the paranormal, he didn't know anything about the Mothman, and he knew very little about John Keel. And guys like you and me, it's almost like sacrilege. What do you mean you don't know about John Keel? What do you mean you haven't read the Mothman prophecies? And for a long time he was being forgotten, and some of his books were not being republished. And so this is really phenomenal that finally we have a book out on John Keel by somebody that, well, I guess you never met him in person.
No,
You
and I
knew
never
him
did.
you knew him as well as you possibly could without actually shaking hands with him.
Right. I wish, I mean, I never dreamed that I would actually attempt to write a book like this. So I always, now I kick myself because, although I've read a lot of what he, wrote, and I had this correspondence and telephone conversations, and it was really fantastic. But I was just using it to, see what I could find out from him that might help me in my own research. I even called him up one time to ask him about the space grass phenomena. Those little aluminum strips that would end up at UFO sites,
Oh yeah.
which I've gathered a few of those myself. Still have them from Pennsylvania and Indiana and Arkansas. And he would say that he took them to the Air Force, and they would say they were different lengths. They were a little different, but that's what he had, and they always just said, well, it's just regular Air Force aluminum chap, but he said it was a little different. And unfortunately, by the time I called him up on the phone years later, He said, "Oh, it was years ago. I can't really remember that much about it anymore. I had a thing from the Air Force that showed where they used to have all these drops, but I live in this tiny apartment in New York, and I threw it away a long time ago. And
Uh,
I thought, damn, I wished I'd been on his list of when you have something to throw away, just send it to this address.
well, fortunately, two gentlemen you and I both know, John and Tim Frick, uh, uh, they uh, they were instrumental in salvaging a lot of his stuff after he passed from his apartment. And Doug Skinner, as I understand, got a hold of a lot of it, and he's been making it available over the period of several years online. So anyway, the whole thing's turned around. Nick Redfern, in one of his recent books, uh, he talked about how John Keel was ahead of his time, and so many people have recognized his Keel's contribution, and so it does my heart good that the tide has turned. Because he was for a while there, he was attacked by some people, and again, he was being forgotten, but it's completely turned around. So that's really good.
Well, if I could, I'd like to mention one little thing
Oh,
here
sure.
before I know we're getting close to the end,
We,
but
we've got time.
okay. Well, when I interviewed Sandra Martin, and this is in the book, in the interview with her, and I actually meant to talk about this a little while ago, but I got sidetracked. Wonder how that happened. Anyway, she was telling me that he would come by her office in New York City and visit her, and if she wasn't busy, they would go out to the Edison Hotel, and there was a restaurant there. And in the back, these old magicians used to gather. And Keel liked to go and just go to this restaurant, and it always introduce her as his book agent and start up a conversation with these magicians. And there was a Ben Robinson, who the New York Times called a master magician, and he wrote a thing. It's on. There's actually a website, and he had an article after the Mothman Prophecies movie came out, uh, telling about Keel and how he had gone to India and places and done this remarkable work, Jadoo, exposing some of the street magicians and the tricks they used, and even mentioned that Keel had a book on a shelf in his apartment where he had a collection of all these different magic tricks. And I wonder if anybody knows whatever happened to that, that.
Huh.
But anyway, she said that as a publisher of New Age books and such, that she always was intrigued by Keel. She'd read, you know, she thought that his The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings, which was Strange Creatures in Time and Space, that book really impressed her. And she said that as despite all the high strangeness stuff that he wrote that was very fascinating, he could also, like herself, be quite skeptical, and he would balance the two. And she said that one time she and him had been invited to attend this event where they had some foreign psychic, and she didn't know who it was, but just remembered he was some foreign guy who was going to demonstrate his psychic powers. And her and John were invited as special guests, and they had a seat right up front where they could be plainly seen that John Keel is here. And there were people from the press there too. And she said that, so we were sitting there, and this was actually in the basement of Ingo Swann.
Oh,
Uh,
and just to tell people, Ingo Swann, famous remote viewer and psychic, helped the military develop their remote viewing program. Go ahead.
so anyway, she said that he had his two hands, out in front of him, and this object was, kind of rising up between his hands, like it looked like it was levitating. And she was just, okay, this is interesting. All of a sudden, John taps her on the shoulder and says, "We got to get out of here." And she says, "What? We got to get out of here now." So, she follows Keel up these stairs out onto the sidewalk, and she says, "Okay, John, what's up?" He said, "Sandra, I can take you down to whatever street it was, a few blocks away. I can take you to a magic shop, and I can teach you that trick in just a few minutes' time. That's nothing but fraud." And he says, we don't need to have somebody from the press taking our picture and making it look like we're supporting this event. And the guy that brought this supposed psychic was a parapsychologist named Alex Emick. And to complete the picture, I asked Doug Skinner about this for the book, and Doug said, "Yeah, I was present when John was explaining to Alex Emick to be careful about magicians. John thought all parapsychologists, paranormal researchers, should be somewhat familiar with magic, tricks,
So,
because
so this guy was buying it that this was some kind of real paranormal phenomenon?
apparently so. Because Doug said that wrote that he didn't look too happy to get this news from John Keel.
And
But she said that she'd tell people there's three grumpy old men here in New York that I just love. She says they are serious. They are good writers. They're doing real research. They really don't get enough credit for what they do. It was John Keel, Ingo Swann, and Alex Emick, all three of them,
oh,
and
jeez.
call them the grumpy old men.
The old curmudgeons.
Yeah.
Well, we
Uh,
are we are getting close to the end of our time, and let me tell you, Brent, this has been the fastest hour I've done. I hope you'll come back and we'll do a part two before too long,
oh, sure.
because
There's all kinds of more things we could talk
I know
about.
there's so much more to talk about just about the book and your other research and so forth. So we'll definitely have to come back. But for right now, tell us about yourself, all your plugs, your websites, and so forth that people should know about.
Well, Alternate Perceptions comes out once a month on the first of each month, and it comes out. It's called Alternate Perceptions. You can find it at apmagazine.info, or just Google Alternate Perceptions, and you'll find us.
And it used to
And
be a real physical magazine, right? Back in the old days.
it did. We were 58 pages, a color cover we had
Uh,
gotten through, and but we started out strong, and but then we were starting to lose subscribers. It was the internet. We realized that we were
yeah.
going to have to shift gears, and we had magazine distributors uh, taking our things to bookstores, our magazine bookstores, and across the U.S. and up into Canada. And one by one, they started dropping us because there just wasn't selling well
Boy,
enough.
boy, I miss those days. But go ahead with your promotions.
Okay, well, on Alternate Perceptions main page, you see my friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Little, a Memphis, Tennessee psychologist who has been supporting me and working with me on the magazine since 1985. He's also a big uh, believer in John Keel's works. He and well, he's mentioned Keel quite a number of times, and there's actually a oh, not to get too far off course, and I probably already have, but
That's fine.
there was a reprint of a few years ago of John Keel's Operation Trojan Horse, and John Keel actually mentions Greg Little in a section of the book, um, saying that he was one of the scientists today who's actually looking at his ideas on the electromagnetic spectrum and the
Ah,
phenomenon. And in 2012, Greg helped Andrew Collins with a book he wanted to get published, and Greg wrote like a 10-page introduction to this book, and it was called Light Quest, and it revolved around Keel's idea about the electromagnetic spectrum and how a lot of these beings and lights are kind of like a plasma energy form. Uh, Kind of like the jinn, the concept of the jinn or whatever. And Keel is mentioned throughout the book.
well, I remember Greg Little's archetype experience from some decades past.
Yeah, that was one of his first books, and then it was People of the Web
Yep.
with a lot of Native American things, and then Grand Illusions and People of the Web, Grand Illusions. We met in '85, but I wrote the forward and afterward to both of those books. And so I'm a John Keel fan and a Greg Little fan.
Well, so am I. And what about your other books? Can we still get them?
Yes, the uh, you know, my book, Visitors from Hidden Realms, even though it's 2004, it's still available. You can get it off of Amazon, or when I do my talks in West Virginia and at the Mothman Festival in September, and then the Alien Expo here in Knoxville, Tennessee, in August. I'll have copies of that very first book. I don't carry around copies of my second one. That was published actually by Tim Beckley, and it was on the edge of reality, and it was a lot of interviews with people I've had in my alternate perceptions over the years, and a lot of interesting subject matter there. I felt that we pulled together that was previously published actually in alternate perceptions,
So we can
but
find you on Amazon. We can find you on YouTube. And the Mothman Festival will be the third weekend in September. So, and you're going to be speaking there about your John Keel book as well.
yeah, and I hope that you'll be the one to give me an introduction.
I think the way that the stars are lining up, it looks like that will be the case. So that will be a blast.
All right, excellent. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Anything else you want to promote before we close out?
I guess that will cover it, Steve.
Okay.
I sure appreciate this opportunity to chat with you again about our mutual friend John Keel, and looking forward to meeting again. We met in 2015 at the Mothman Festival. You
That's
were
right. You
you
were
were
on
out.
my haunted Mothman hayride, as I recall,
Yes,
with your
yes,
grandson.
yeah, yeah. My wife and grandson, and we got stopped by those
Dastardly Men in Black. Yes.
men in black in the most primitive form of transportation. There, the golf carts,
Yes. Yes.
budgetary cutback.
Well, no more black Cadillacs. Well, Brent, I cannot thank you enough for being on the High Strangeness Factor. And stay there. I'm going to do my closeout, but I'm really looking forward to having you again on the show because to use the old cliche, we just barely scratched the surface.
Amen. Thank you
I,
very much.
okay, you're welcome. Also, I need to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, our fearless leaders here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Andy Mercer is not only my part-time co-host, but he is also the producer of the show and makes it sound as good as it possibly can. I also want to thank Brian Zeller, who does the original music for the show. I can be heard weekly as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files on this same network. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thanks for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. And with a nod to Mike Jarmus, who used to do a show similar to this one, I'm going to borrow his sign-off that he used to use. There's something going on, and he's right. Take care.